They were days away from running out of cash. Not months, not weeks, days. And while the world was watching banks collapse on live TV, one of America's most iconic car companies was quietly staring at a future where the lights might shut off forever. No bailout check. No government rescue plan ready. Just a ticking clock, billions in debt, and a decision made years earlier that would either save Ford or bury it. Here's the part nobody talks about. If one meeting in a glass conference room hadn't gone a certain way, Ford Motor Company might not exist today. And the reason has nothing to do with bad cars. It has everything to do with timing, ego, and one terrifying bet. Stay with me, because by the end of this story, the entire 2008 financial crisis is going to look very different than you remember. Especially if you drive a Ford. Back in the mid-2000s, America was feeling unstoppable. Gas was cheap. Credit was easy. Housing prices were climbing like they'd never come down. If you drove through places like Phoenix, Las Vegas, or the outskirts of Atlanta, it felt like a new subdivision popped up every month. And Ford? Ford was still riding on its legacy. F-150 is everywhere. Mustangs roaring down highways. Dealerships glowing like casinos off suburban interstates. On the surface, Ford looked fine. But underneath, the math was ugly. Really ugly. By 2005, Ford was bleeding money. Not a little. Billions. Their costs were out of control. Healthcare obligations for retirees were massive. Factories were built for a world that no longer existed. America wasn't buying sedans the way it used to. Imports were eating market share. Toyota and Honda were cleaning up with smaller, more efficient cars. Ford knew something had to change. That's when the company made a move that shocked Wall Street. In 2006, Ford did something no one expected. They mortgaged basically everything. Not a building. Not a division. Everything. The blue oval logo. Factories. Intellectual property. Ford walked into banks in New York and said, "We want to borrow as much money as humanly possible." At the time, analysts thought it was reckless. Why would a 100-year-old company take on tens of billions in debt? Because Ford saw something coming. Or at least, they felt something wasn't right. Alan Mulally had just taken over as CEO. Not a car guy. Not Detroit royalty. He came from Boeing. An outsider. And when he looked at Ford's books, he didn't see tradition. He saw a house of cards. Mulally believed Ford didn't have a profitability problem. They had a survival problem. So he pushed through what became known internally as the big bet. In 2006, Ford secured roughly $23 billion in loans. At the peak of the credit bubble, the timing mattered more than anyone realized. Because 2 years later, the entire global financial system imploded. Lehman Brothers collapsed. Bear Stearns vanished. Banks froze lending overnight. Car sales didn't slow down, they fell off a cliff. In 2008, US auto sales dropped to levels not seen in decades. Showrooms were empty. Factories went dark. Entire towns built around auto plants felt the shock instantly. GM and Chrysler were burning cash so fast it scared the government. Ford had cash. But that didn't mean they were safe. Because having money and losing money are two very different things. By late 2008, Ford was losing billions per quarter. Every month, more cash vanished. Executives were running models trying to answer one question. How long until zero? The answer kept getting shorter. Here's where the fear gets real. Ford's leadership had a nightmare scenario they didn't talk about publicly. What if the government bailout for GM and Chrysler poisoned public opinion? What if buying an American car suddenly felt like buying a failing brand? What if customers stopped trusting Detroit altogether? Ford refused the bailout money. Not because they didn't need help, but because taking it might have destroyed the brand long term. Imagine that pressure. Your competitors are begging Washington for survival. Your company is bleeding, and you're betting the entire future on pride, discipline, and a loan you took years earlier. Inside Ford headquarters in Dearborn, meetings got tense. This wasn't theory anymore. This was payroll, suppliers, dealers calling every day asking if they should shut down. Families depended on these decisions. Entire Midwestern communities. Ford wasn't just fighting a recession. They were fighting collapse psychology. Because once people believe a company is dying, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Customers hesitate. Suppliers tighten terms. Credit dries up faster. And here's the part most people miss. Ford's biggest enemy in 2008 wasn't Toyota. It wasn't gas prices. It was time. Every quarter they lost money. The clock ticked louder. That's the problem Ford was facing. And it's the same problem a lot of people face in their own lives. You can be doing everything right. Working hard. Cutting costs. Trying to adapt. But if the environment turns against you fast enough, Effort alone isn't enough. You need margin. Ford's margin was cash, and it was shrinking. So they did something radical. They stopped pretending everything was fine. Internally, Mullally created brutal transparency. Every week, executives had to present problems in front of everyone. No spin, no hiding. Red meant red. At first, nobody wanted to admit failure. Then one executive finally did. And instead of getting fired, he got help. That moment changed the culture. Ford started moving faster, selling off luxury brands like Jaguar, Land Rover, and Volvo, killing pet projects, focusing everything on fewer, better vehicles. This wasn't glamorous. It was survival mode. Meanwhile, the public narrative was brutal. Headlines lumped Ford in with failed Detroit automakers. Late-night jokes didn't differentiate. If you drove a Ford, people assumed the company was doomed. That stigma almost killed sales. But something strange happened in 2009. While GM dealerships were closing by the hundreds, Ford stayed open. While competitors restructured under government control, Ford kept shipping cars. And slowly, perception shifted. Wait, Ford didn't take bailout money? That became a talking point, then a badge of honor, but make no mistake. This wasn't a victory lap. Ford still came dangerously close to the edge. At one point, their automotive operations had just enough cash to survive another year. If the recession had lasted longer, if gas prices had spiked again, if one major product launch had failed, that would have been it. That's the part history smooths over. Now let's talk about the moment everything hinged on. The turning point didn't come from Washington. It didn't come from Wall Street. It came from focus. Ford bet everything on doing fewer things better. They unified global platforms, stopped building different cars for every market, cut complexity that had been quietly draining money for decades. And then, finally, the market stabilized. Not overnight, slowly, painfully. By 2010, Ford posted its first annual profit in years. It wasn't huge, but it meant survival. The same loans that nearly crushed them became the reason they lived. That 2006 decision, the one everyone mocked, it gave Ford oxygen when the world ran out of air. Here's the real lesson. Ford didn't survive 2008 because they were perfect. They survived because they prepared when others were comfortable. They took pain early instead of denying reality. And they understood something most companies don't. You don't go bankrupt when you lose money, you go bankrupt when you run out of time. That's why this story matters. It's not just about cars. It's about recognizing danger before it has a name. Ford almost disappeared. Not because of bad engineering, but because the world changed faster than legacy systems could adapt. And one decision made quietly before the storm kept a century-old company alive. Next time you see a Ford badge on the road, remember that. If you want to see how another massive company barely survived a moment nobody saw coming, watch the next video on your screen. Subscribe if you want more real stories like this. And drop a comment if you remember where you were when the 2008 crash hit. History feels different when you know how close it really came.